the whole city was on display. All the suburbs, all the houses, you could see pretty much everything.
Which had to be like, what a moment.
Welcome to Archaeology Books for Fun, digging books that aren't drier than dirt. I'm your host, Tristan Herenstein. With me, as always, is my co-host, Barbara Clark.
Hello, everybody.
And today we are diving into the third part of Archaeology from Space by Sarah Parcak. And if you've listened to the previous two, we're struggling with this book a little. There's some bits in there that we like, and then we're kind of having problems with some of the rest of it.
Well, and it's interesting because I know you read some of the reviews and some of them pointed out that it didn't have as much space stuff as they wanted. And I feel like that's kind of what I'm getting to.
Yeah, so we've had some chapters we enjoyed, and then let's see what we get to in this one.
And even the chapters that don't have a lot of space, like they're interesting, I guess. They're just, I'm like, why is this here?
So let's dive in to chapter 5, which is titled Digging in the Wrong Place. And so this uses part of Indiana Jones as kind of a framework, I suppose, for the chapter. Specifically, the part where Indiana Jones is looking for the lost city of Tanis. Was it Tanis?
Yes.
And they have a whole section where they realize that the Nazis are digging in the wrong place and all that stuff. And so this actually ends up being about their investigation into the city of Tanis. And so we've known where Tanis is for a long time. No, sorry. They weren't looking for Tanis. They were looking for a specific place in Tanis.
Yes.
I think they knew where it was.
Yes.
Because we've known where Tanis was for a long time.
Yeah.
So this is in Egypt, and it's a very large Egyptian city. It was a capital at some points, at least. She says it's 2 kilometers long and 1.5 kilometers wide, and there's lots of debris and stuff around.
And one thing I will say is she talks a lot about the different dynasties, different periods in Egyptian history. Don't get bogged down with that. Like, it's a lot, but I feel like without focusing too much on that, you still get the message. You still get the message that she's trying to put forth.
Yeah, and we've talked about that before, how we don't have a lot of patience for all the Egyptian dynasties and stuff.
Right.
So if that's something you love, then you might really appreciate this book.
Right.
But definitely not our cup of tea.
But you can still, it's worth pushing through.
Mm-hmm. I did appreciate the description of walking through the kind of the mud brick debris silt plain of Tanis and how the mud cakes onto your boots.
Yep.
I've known people like pull muscles because of that, basically.
I once lost a boot. Like, I was able to recover said boot, but my foot came up and the boot did not.
Yeah. So like I said, they initially started looking at Tanis very early, 1800s and then 1900s. It seems like there was a serious investigation, but because of the nature of archaeology in these times, the focus was pretty exclusively on the temples. And the big fancy looking places, and a lot of places ignored the more everyday.
Yeah, which that's true not just in Egypt. That was just archaeology in general during that
very much
time
a
period.
Worldwide thing at that time. Yeah. And they didn't understand how much they could figure out from the debris and stuff at that time either.
Yeah, I think a lot of it was about the glitzy things, the fancy things, and this is really cool.
I think we needed that to get to the point where we realized there's more we could get out of it.
Probably. I agree. Yeah.
And so our author, she worked on this site as an undergrad a bit, and then used some satellite data on it like a decade later. And she was lucky enough, as in being in education, she got a deal on high resolution satellite data, so she got some really good information and had a pretty remarkable result, essentially. And she describes some of the techniques here, which was actually really good. Didn't go too deep into the technical stuff, but kind of gave us a sense of what all is involved in this process. It's not just looking at pictures.
Yeah, and I feel like she's done that several times throughout this book so far, and it's kind of cool to see how they can, I hate to use the word manipulate because that makes people think they're like making things up, but essentially kind of fit the maps, the different layers to each other, because they're different resolutions, they're different, sizes, and so you kind of have to massage them a little bit to get them all to layer on top of each other correctly, and it's really interesting the way that's done with various levels of technology.
Yeah, and in this case, she had some multispectral maps and had some black and white maps. Each of those show different things, but then basically she could combine the two to show new things entirely.
Yeah, which is so cool.
Yeah, very
That's
cool.
really cool.
And so essentially, like, the whole city was on display, like all the suburbs, all the houses. You could see pretty much everything.
Which had to be like really like what a moment to be able to see that, you know?
Is this the one where she said she screamed when she saw it?
It might be.
I think it might be. Which is
Yeah.
fair. I was a little irritated because I couldn't understand this, because she was trying to turn the lines into a GIS program we call ArcGIS. She's trying to map in there, but it's not going to be a clean thing. She's looking very small, so it gets pixelated and everything. And so they had the brilliant idea to print it all out and then draw it all by hand. And like, that's not clever.
Yeah, and like the number of hours they spent doing that,
Yeah.
I was like,
Well,
with all the technology, and you're trying to talk about how awesome this technology is, and then you're like, well, it wasn't working, so we're just gonna hand draw.
Well, literally about that time, literally about this exact same time, we had someone come into UWF and talk to students and professors about something he was working on, underwater archaeology. He was doing photogrammetry. He was taking tons of photos of shipwrecks, and then in a couple days you could have all these photos of the shipwrecks, put it into some software, and then they've got a 3D model of the whole shipwreck as it is in just a few hours. And then he was even showing everybody, because what the underwater archaeologist guys will do is, like, for example, he was working with a wooden barrel, and they will draw that out, and then they will draw all the wood grain into that. And so he showed them that with this technology, he could like have a photo of the wood barrel that he'd taken based off the 3D model and do some stuff in Photoshop, and in 5 minutes he had what looked like a hand-drawn image of the barrel, and everybody in that room groaned because they had been spending hours drawing stuff like this.
Well, and even just think of like terrestrial archaeology and, all the site illustrations. I remember in undergrad, for volunteer hours, I worked with one of my professors and did some hand drawings for her of artifacts mostly, but also I like redrew some site maps and stuff because they were kind of messy. And now we can just do that with a camera.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying is they could have done this with just Photoshop, essentially.
Because they spent like, I think it was like 8 weeks on this. Oh my gosh. Yeah, that's more than an entire field school.
Yeah, that was a long time. But anyway, once they got this done, so she tries to do a cost estimate of this versus doing this by fieldwork, and part of that estimate was the 8 weeks they spent hand drawing, which I had a little issue with that. But otherwise, the cost estimate is a pretty huge difference. Like just to have the crew out there and everything to find this in the first place is pretty dramatically different.
Yeah, but the hand drawing definitely like
threw me off.
Skewed the results.
Yeah, definitely threw it. Yeah. But as she said, and as is maybe one of the few positive things I can say about the Lost City of the Monkey God, you can't just rely on the data, you have to ground truth.
Yep.
And so she basically works with another archaeologist who's out there, and he'd not worked with satellite data before, she said, and he was very skeptical of what they were finding. And then she goes and joins them mid-season, and he's just like totally converted. He's like, this stuff's amazing.
Yep.
Because everything they said was there, and then they found some things that didn't show up, which that's not surprising. Some smaller rooms and stuff were too small for the resolution of the imagery and that kind of a thing.
I do like the way she treats people who are skeptical.
Yeah.
Because it's not in a negative light. And I think, especially with science and new technology, a certain amount of skepticism is healthy. So I like the way she's not like, this guy, he doesn't, she doesn't berate him or put him down for being skeptical. She's just like, he was skeptical and this is a thing and we're going to give it a try, you know?
Yeah, I feel like she understands the value of their skepticism.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, the results were interesting. They got a lot of different life in Tanis information. One was I think a large house where the priests lived, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And kind of a notable thing for me was it had a separate bathroom.
Right.
Which, 5,000 years ago, that's pretty impressive.
Yeah, that's fancy.
Yeah. South of there, so the temples are to the north. Directly south of that are the priests' quarters. And then directly south of that are the nobles. And I think the king was there in those villas.
Yeah.
So these are some large villas where the elites were. And then south of that are 8 by 8 meter homes with typically 2 rooms. And this is where your kind of everyday person lived. And so they're able to identify and investigate, I think, all stages of that, essentially.
Yeah, I thought it was really cool the way she kind of related it to like different zip codes of Tanis. Like, you have your different kind of neighborhoods and stuff. And it really kind of brought to light that that's kind of how we live today, right? So not a lot of difference in that regard.
Then she tries to get into some estimating the population of Tanis from satellites. And basically she says it's difficult. But kind of what we're getting to was there was kind of the main hub, but there's all these other satellite communities around it. And she doesn't get into this, but I wondered if it was worth talking about what constitutes a city a little bit here, like in Four Lost Cities.
I was thinking about that too, yeah. Like I was reminded of Four Lost Cities.
Right, because in those cases, they present a few cities where our idea of a city is not how it was functioning. There were farms and stuff inside the city.
Right.
Essentially what came down to.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if maybe the definition of a city doesn't quite apply the same in this context, which the author here doesn't say either way. She just is talking about how trying to get all of these different aspects of this community is difficult.
Yeah. And I mean, can you even really apply the word city to an ancient settlement, or series of settlements? I don't know. It would depend on your definition, I guess.
It would depend on how you define it, or maybe you add descriptors to the term city so you can define different types of cities. Yeah, there's different ways of handling it. I don't have the information right now to dive into that, though. And then she uses a puzzle analogy, which I appreciate.
I made a note. I put your name next to it.
Yeah.
I was like, oh, Tristan's going to like this one.
Then we talk a little bit about current satellite technology down to 0.3 meter resolution. Kind of interesting, I thought, because now she's looking at it with this high resolution satellite imagery, but is not necessarily finding it is easier. So part of the issue is time of year, how wet or dry the place is, time of the day it was taken. And so this newer higher resolution imagery shows some things and then doesn't show some other things, essentially is what it comes down to.
Yeah. I think it is interesting, especially in a place like Egypt where there are floods and there are monsoons, really dry seasons. I bet the satellite imagery is so different depending on the season, like more so than you would find probably in like Florida and stuff.
And in the case of the first time they were using this, the mud brick and the silt, the sandy silt, had just slightly different reflection, and that allowed the equipment to pick out the difference. But when the moisture is not quite the same, then that messed that all up.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah, it's pretty cool how the environment can affect the technology.
And then we do a little talk about how the past informs today and how we can look at these ancient cities and look at our cities and draw parallels or look at where they had critical problems that kind of led to the city falling apart. But there's not like a ton of deep analysis in this part.
No, and she talks about it in future chapters as well a little bit, but I think that is something that's kind of overlooked with archaeology. It's not something a lot of people think of, is how what we learn as archaeologists can inform the current state of things and the future, and from everything from societal issues to urban planning and stuff like that. And, people tend to think of us as these weird little nerds that study the past.
Which isn't wrong.
But we do have skills and information that can be useful in planning the future too. So I just feel like I have to point that out, justify our existence, Tristan.
Yeah, we mattered.
We matter. Gosh.
So I like that chapter.
Yeah, no, this was a cool chapter. I think the way she explained the technology was really interesting and how the environment impacts the technology, and overall very cool. A lot of spacey stuff.
We had a beef with the hand drawing of the map, but that's not a big deal.
Yeah.
The chapter was good. It was interesting. It was kind of what I expected this book to be.
Right. Yeah.
And then we get to chapter 6.
Which this is just weird.
So I'm going to propose that we do this a little differently, because this whole chapter is like that section where she was just kind of listing specialties in archaeology.
Yeah.
And there's not that much there. So let's go through and just talk about any couple of points we thought was interesting. And then I think this chapter is where I understood why we're struggling with this book.
Okay.
So that's what I want to talk about.
Well, and just to summarize, the title title of this chapter is The Grand Tour. And she just kind of takes us on a tour of all these various sites that have used technology. Or
Well,
not even.
it's typically either has used technology to discover things or could use technology to discover things.
Which is like
everything.
everywhere.
Yeah.
Right. So it's kind of weird.
Well, let's talk a little about the estimate of how many undiscovered sites are in the world or in America. Let's just do America because her statistics are really strange to me. She starts with a county in Northern California that has 10,000 recorded sites.
Right.
And then from there extrapolates based off of that how many unrecorded sites are in all of North America. But major problem here. Well, first of all, I'm sure she means Native American.
Right. That was one of my issues is what are you considering an archaeological site?
But also in pre-Columbian times, that the Pacific Northwest was like incredibly densely populated. And it is not a good representation of the rest of the continent.
Right. And you take into the geography of the continent, the path that people traveled to populate the continent, which is a whole nother, like that could be a podcast in and of itself. There's no way to extrapolate this information from one county. It's very simplified.
Yep.
And you can't do that. People are complicated.
It is not a very useful attempt in estimating, I don't think.
And again, in the United States, anything 50 years old or older is considered archaeological.
Right.
And it seems to me that she's only looking at like indigenous sites, which skews the results completely.
And if that's what you're looking at, you could define that, but she didn't define that.
But she does not define that, which is problematic.
Yeah. Anyway, I saw the Fer-de-Lance showed up again.
Yes.
Which we talked about ad nauseum in Lost City of the Monkey God.
At least she didn't have like the head of one staked to a tree or whatever.
Photo of that. That was so weird. It was a very much talking about how inhospitable this area was once again, which it didn't go on as much as Lost City of the Monkey God, but yeah, we did talk about Easter Island and the study that showed that the giant heads walked.
Yeah.
So they were like basically rocked back and forth upright, and how the study found some that had not made it and fell over and were broken. And so that basically told us, because there's this whole idea that the locals like destroyed their own environment making these heads and building like rollers for them to go on or something, which is not what happened.
Right.
But we talked about that in Four Lost Cities and in Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries.
Yeah, I was going to say that's a common theme is how, these civilizations destroyed their environment and they were short-sighted and all that. And I feel like a lot of that comes from like a colonialistic perspective.
Yeah.
Very detrimental.
And then we do talk about the Khmer a little bit once again, which we talked about quite a lot in Four Lost Cities also. Anchor, essentially, is what we were talking about in that one. But this one frustrated me because this was there's a lot we could do, but no one's done anything stuff. Whereas Four Lost Cities talked about using LiDAR to reveal that Anchor was as big as the records in Anchor say they were.
Yeah.
And undo the colonial perspectives.
I was a little annoyed by that too. I'm like, you literally are writing a book on space archaeology and you're saying that there hasn't been a lot done here, yet we read another book that was not about space archaeology.
That was written before this one too.
Yeah, that's true.
So this data, this report is out there that this was based off of.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So we do revisit the Indus Valley, which we talked about in the other ancient civilizations.
As well as Peru. We visit Peru.
Once again, yes. So we kind of get a lot of stuff that we've touched on, which is kind of fun to revisit some of these places.
It was just a lot for one chapter. I feel like this entire chapter could be a book.
Yeah. So any other highlights, or are we ready to talk about the book as a whole here? Because I think I figured out in this chapter what my issue was.
I'm curious.
This is an archaeologist who's trying to do interpretation, but doesn't have a core idea to guide the interpretation. She has a subject.
Yeah.
And because she doesn't have an idea guiding the book, things just kind of go everywhere.
Yeah. I would agree with that. And I was going to say, in this chapter too, it's out of place. Like, why is this chapter even here?
Yeah. And to her credit, I think she understands that you can't do something for public audiences the same way you do for a school or for professional audiences. But what she ends up doing is trying to throw things in to make it interesting. But because those things aren't guided by a core idea, they end up being distracting or confusing.
Yeah.
For example, in this chapter, at the end, there is a entirely random, no context, has nothing to do with anything story about a man she knew who demanded she marry his toothless son. And she said, he won't be able to enjoy my cooking. And the man said, that's okay, he can enjoy your soup. Which is kind of funny, but it had nothing to do with anything.
I feel like some of the stories she tells are like archaeologists sitting around the bar at the end of a long day at the conference, chatting about, funny fieldwork stories. And to her, they're funny and interesting, and they add like little quirkiness.
Make it publicly accessible.
Yeah.
But it's not working for us.
No. And like that story, there's been several stories where I'm like, why? Like,
not just stories too, but also facts, information that is interesting, but like this doesn't connect to anything.
Well, it's like, and I know you and I, when we give presentations, we usually know a lot more about the topic than what we're discussing. And we, of course, without like having a proper theme and stuff, we would just word vomit at these folks being like, oh my gosh, these are all the cool things.
Right.
And it kind of comes across like that. Like,
I think that's what's going on here exactly. Yeah. So the subject is satellite archaeology.
Yeah.
And that's where it stops.
Right.
And this chapter is kind of a good example of it too.
Yes.
Because what is the core idea here? Is this about how much we could learn from satellites, or is how much satellites teach us?
Yeah.
It's not laid out that it's about either or both from the start, and then we get kind of confused.
She does like try to, I do appreciate trying to give her credit where credit is due, that she tries to create a tour out of it and kind of put us in that position and like make us imagine being there.
That would work.
Right.
But it's just not tied into anything.
No, it's weird in this book.
And it doesn't fit the rest of the book.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's also, I think, why we keep hearing her say the real interesting stuff is in the everyday, and we keep coming back to the jewels and the gold and stuff. Because I think she thinks that this is what needs to happen to engage audiences.
Right. Which we fully disagree.
Well, in reality, the everyday is interesting, but you can't just vomit words at people. You need to actually have an idea you're trying to communicate to them.
I feel like this chapter, if she were to kind of work with it, she could turn this chapter into a really interesting book.
Yeah.
This chapter alone. It doesn't need to be a chapter in this book. It could be another book.
And to give some listeners examples, books that had a really strong organizing theme. There's actually quite a few of the ones we've liked most have Small Things Forgotten.
That's the first one that came to my mind. Yep.
Stealing History for Lost Cities was extremely well thought out in the ideas. We had small issues with a lot of these, but it was well organized and it had a core idea it was trying to communicate.
Yeah.
Or a few of them, at least, but it was well defined. And then some of the books that didn't do it as well as these, I would say Finders Keepers could have. Like, there was the core idea, but he didn't stick to it or got distracted from by other things, or something went wrong there.
Yeah.
But he had a really strong core idea. I don't think Ancient Brews had a very strong core idea. Like, he kind of made it work most of the time.
Every chapter was just, this is a different beer.
Yeah.
It was interesting, and I think that's fine.
And he would tell stories, and I'd have to think, okay, why is he telling the story? And I could usually come up with a reason, but it wasn't really obvious.
Yeah. Again, there were parts of that book that smacked of like sitting around the bar telling archaeology stories.
It was very enjoyable though. Still,
Yeah.
I would recommend that one for someone to read for fun.
Yeah, especially if you're a beer person.
Right.
Well, and I keep reading things and I'm like, okay, we'll probably come back to this. Like I feel like it keeps setting me up for something, but then it never happens. So you're kind of left just wondering.
Which is something that Lost City of the Monkey God did a lot too.
Oh my gosh, so much. Yes.
Although
that was even worse though.
Oh, there's that one I really disliked for like a personal, like ethical issue. This one I'm having trouble reading it.
Yes.
That's the difference here. Although that one had a lot of the same issues on making it readable too, though at least it was kind of a common narrative theme for it.
Well, and that one also, it was kind of poorly written.
Yeah.
This one is not, from like a grammatical standpoint.
Yes.
It's not poorly written.
From a structural standpoint,
it's weak. Yeah. Agreed.
All right. So that's kind of where I realized where the problem was I sometimes I need to really read a few of these to really define that. And this is really what this podcast is all about. We're not just reporting on the books here. We're bringing our perspectives as archaeologists and interpreters to the table.
Yeah.
And if that's what you're here for, hit follow and the next episode will show up in your library automatically. We release an episode every 1st and 15th. All right, enough about that, though. Soapbox temporarily over.
We shall step down from our soapbox, but we're keeping the soapbox here.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
it's sticking around.
Yeah. The last chapter for this episode, titled Empire's Fall. And this just, again, highlights kind of my definition of the problem with this book. Like you said, we stopped here. Maybe this is leading into something that will pay off next chapter. But this feels, again, like a different book. Nothing in this book relates to what's going on in this chapter. It's like a narrative point. So in this case, she is using a named, I think must be excavators that gave the name for a woman who was her grave was excavated, and creates a whole historical fiction narrative around this person,
which can be done well.
We have seen it done well.
Yes, it's weird to me to just do it in a random chapter. It feels like maybe she learned of this technique of storytelling in the middle of writing this book, and she's like, ooh, I'm going to try it.
I mean, this has been the last 2 chapters now. It's like, why is this? This does not feel like the same book.
Right, exactly. That's what I'm saying. She just was like, you know what? I learned about this thing. We're going to try it.
This even more so.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So essentially what we're doing in this case is we're intermittently going between the historical fiction and then talking about the archaeology. I'm not sure what to make of this, and I'm not sure quite why I feel so differently about this sometimes than so one book that I thought did it very well in particular was The Other Ancient Civilizations.
Yeah.
Every chapter started off with a little historical fiction narrative, and then it basically immediately talked about the basis for that narrative. And I think that's kind of what she's doing here, but it feels like there's a lot more added.
She fills in a lot of gaps with
and you have to do that some, but too many liberties maybe.
Yeah, that was my issue as well, because it makes it hard to discern what is fact and what is fiction,
even when you provide the fact right after the fiction.
Yeah, because sometimes I was left wondering, well, do we know this, or is this where she just kind of filled something in?
Well, and some of the facts, part of the problem too, I think, is some of the facts didn't pay off until the end of the chapter.
Yeah.
So for example, there's one where she's a little girl and she observes that her mother has sandy colored lines in her teeth.
Yeah.
And she doesn't have that. We don't find out to the very end of the chapter, after a whole person's life is basically laid before us, that was because lacking nutrition as children caused that to happen in the development of the teeth.
Which I knew where she was going with that.
I assume too.
As an archaeologist. But as someone who may not have any basis of understanding for that, I feel like it might be a little frustrating.
Yeah. Essentially, the narrative, to summarize it really quickly, is it takes place at the end of the Old Kingdom in Egypt, where they've had a ruler for almost a century who, oddly, usually you have a ruler for a century, that's pretty good stability, but apparently he kind of drove everything into the dirt. And on top of this, all of a sudden, the Nile stops flooding regularly.
Yeah.
Which causes drought, which causes famine. And so essentially, like we learned in Four Lost Cities, those two things combined led to the end of that version of Egyptian government and society. And so essentially, she is starting off in a small village area, and they're starving, and the lord of that area sends them to the bigger city basically to try and get food for them, and then they end up kind of finding prosperity in that city.
Yeah.
Another thing about this story is really depressing.
Yeah.
I kind of get it. It is a depressing and stressful time, but it just comes out of nowhere too as part of it too. I think that doesn't help, but they're starving, and it is descriptions of their desiccated bodies.
I know.
And her brother dies of starvation,
yeah.
and that describes the burial for him, and it's just woof.
Yeah. This chapter, the previous chapter was weird, and then this chapter got weirder for me, where I was just I don't know what's happening.
The previous chapter, at least, I'd seen her list stuff like this before.
Yeah.
And we have had a small historical fiction section before, but nothing like this. And we don't know why she's doing this, because it doesn't ever tie into satellite archaeology
No,
in this
there's
chapter.
yeah,
Right? I want to add that
this
qualify. But instead of telling us at the start, this is what we're doing and why, we're spending the whole time wondering, trying to figure out what's going on and why.
yeah, this whole chapter, as I was reading it, I was like, okay, no satellite yet. Okay, no map yet. Maybe we're going to talk about, because then when she starts talking about the cemetery, we know that like LiDAR and things like that can be useful. And I thought she was going to start talking about how maybe the cemetery was bigger than they initially thought, and they found that out through LiDAR or something. I was like, oh my gosh, where is this going? And we still don't know. So it's a little frustrating to read when you don't know where you're going. And our minds, as readers, as humans, we're
looking for connections.
Yeah, we look for connections, and we want to kind of know where we're going. Like there's a typical way to tell a story, and there's like the intro, there's the body, there's the conclusion. And somewhere in there, it's just
a pretty common tactic for lots of things is to tell the audience exactly what's going to happen before you tell them what's going to happen.
Yeah.
I like to use example of A Christmas Story from Charles Dickens, The Visit from Ghost Marley. His whole point is to tell us and Scrooge what's going to happen in the rest of the book.
Yeah.
So not that you have to do that all the time, but there is real value in that, or at least giving us enough information that we can see what's going to happen.
Yeah. I mean, this chapter didn't really even have any archaeology, so to speak of.
It was just history and historical fiction.
Yeah.
That we knew of, right? It wasn't laid out. Yeah. So one interesting thing, though, one thing I thought was really cool, because it tied back into the book, is because this drought period is tied into what she called the 4.2 KABP event, which is a really odd way of phrasing that, I thought.
I get the feeling that is pretty much what Egyptologists call this part.
I would just call it the 4.2 KYA event. So the difference, what we're doing here is KA is 1,000. I don't know what the A stands for, actually, in that. 1,000 ago BP, but KYA just stands for 1,000 years ago. Anyway, but this event was a worldwide cooling period where things got drier and cooler. And hoofbeats taught us that this was a time when the steppe cultures rose up.
Yep.
And that's exactly what happened here. This is when the Yamanaya culture rose to power and expanded really aggressively. And so this is a pattern we see throughout history, is when you have these cooler periods, the steppe horse-based cultures gain power and expand, and then you have the wetter, hotter periods, and that's when the more agricultural societies gain power and expand. And I thought it was kind of cool that tied in that way.
Yeah, that I noticed that too, because I was like, ooh, okay. But it's interesting. I don't know. I feel like there was a lot she could have done with this chapter to tie it into her use of technology. And I'm very curious to see if that's where we're going.
Yeah.
But I'm kind of concerned based on what we've read so far that is not where we're going.
Yeah. And yeah, because that's happened before. Right. So the other chapter that I liked in particular, and right now, if someone was wanting to read this, I'd tell them to read chapters 4 and 5. And chapter 4 was the one all about the Vikings.
Yeah.
But that one started off talking about the size and complexity of excavation crews in Egypt, and then switched over to Vikings, where there's 3 people involved. There was no connecting between those ideas.
Yeah.
That's in one chapter. So are we going to get something bridging over from chapter to chapter? We haven't seen any sign of that yet.
Yeah, which is something else that kind of bothers me.
Because there's no core idea, right? That's guiding this whole thing.
Because you can have different stories in different chapters, but they should all tie into the overarching umbrella theme of the book.
Yep.
So we're just having some thematic issues here.
And for listeners, Barbara is using theme in the way we use it as interpreters.
True.
Which is just basically, what is the core idea? What is the takeaway, depending on how you look at it. So we differentiate between theme and subject.
Yeah.
So that is it for this chapter this time. Y'all can tell we're struggling a little.
I'm hopeful, though. I'm going to remain hopeful, Tristan.
I always remain hopeful, but... I don't know.
I mean, we could be reading Lost City of the Monkey Gods right now.
Which I remain hopeful in that one, too. I've been burned before, Barbara. I think we could still have some chapters we really like in this.
I think so.
I think that's very possible.
Yeah.
And so that's what I'm going to hope for. I think we'll still have frustrations, and I think that's okay. It gives us things to talk about. But yeah, so I think that wraps us up for this time, though. Hope you enjoyed it at home. Next time, we will be reading Chapter 8 and Chapter 9. And after that, we'll have one more episode to go. So until then, we'll see you all next time.
Happy reading, everybody.